Hi, my name is Max Flynn, and this is the last episode of the History Podcast, sponsored by the Washington Legislative Internship Program. Today, I'm joined with Thomas Dubow. Thomas, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, Max, I would like to introduce myself. Hello to you, the listener, and thank you for joining us in what will be a marvelous adventure into the history of what, Max?
The Alaska-Yukon-Pacific-Exposition. Now, Tommy, do you mind if I call you Tommy?
Call me Tom.
Tom. All right, Tom. What do you know of the 1909 World's Fair, also known as the Alaska-Yukon-Pacific-Exposition?
Well, Max, that's a great question, and that's what our listeners should be asking themselves right now. I don't know much, but what I can tell you about the 1909 Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Expo is that it was held at what is today the University of Washington's Seattle campus, which, might I add, Max, if I may be so bold.
As bold as you want.
Given that we are both students of UW Seattle.
We are.
I think that it's an objective fact, despite our bias, despite what could be perceived as bias towards UW Seattle and that campus, the objective fact that it's the best campus in the world.
See, I think it is among, if not the best campus in the world, because it did host this 1909 World's Fair. But we'll get into the meat of that a little bit later. Let's start out with a little bit of the detail, the context, all right? Okay, the Alaska-Yukon-Pacific-Exposition. It also had acronyms that it was known by, such as the AYP or the AYPE. This was a World's Fair held in Seattle as established before, and it was held in 1909, and it was to mark the development of the Pacific Northwest. It was originally planned to be held in 1907 to mark the 10th anniversary of the Klondike Gold Rush, but the organizers learned of the Jamestown Exposition that was being held the same year, and they rescheduled. Now, Tom, I believe you wanted to say something on the Klondike Gold Rush.
Yeah, so I think what's significant about them rescheduling around the Jamestown Expo is that this period in the early 1900s is really, I believe, in modern history, one of the first globalization. So a World's Fair is a huge deal, and the last thing you would want to is split your target audience between two different
Right.
In this sort of global cosmopolitan context where, by the way, transportation has exploded as a technology that that revolutionizes the way people are able to travel and conduct business and so on and so forth. So, what I find interesting is that there was so much intention behind this, the planning and organization of the Alaska-Yukon-Pacific Expo, because what mattered was putting Seattle on the map as what?
As a metropolis. They wanted to establish Seattle as a commercial hub, as a metropolis for the hinterlands of Alaska and Eastern Asia. Now, they really wanted to have not only the region to view Seattle as this commercial hub between East and West, but they also wanted the nation and the world to view Seattle as a connection between the Eastern goods or the Western goods and the Eastern market. Because Asia at this time was viewed as an untapped market to European salesmen and businesses, and they wanted to tap this market. Seattle was in line to position itself for this goal. Now, we'll go a little bit more into how they did this with the World's Fair, but let's set up more of the context. Now, as we've said before, the fairgrounds, they were held on University of Washington campus in an undeveloped portion of the present-day campus. Now, Godfrey Cheelander proposed the idea for the fair. Cheelander was then Grand Secretary of the Arctic Brotherhood, a fraternity that dealt in matters of the Arctic and mainly Alaska. He was involved in the Alaska Territory exhibit in 1905, the Lewis and Clark Exposition in Portland, Oregon. Originally, he pitched William Sheffield of the Alaska Club and James A. Wood, city editor of the Seattle City Times, on the idea of a permanent exhibit in Seattle about Alaska. This merged with Wood's desire for an exposition to rival Portland. Now, as we said before, Seattle wanted to position itself as a commercial hub. Now, it's important to understand who they wanted to position themselves in front of. Tacoma at this time was one of the largest cities in current-day Washington, and Portland was the hub of the Pacific Northwest. This was the established city. Now, Seattle wanted to beat out both of these cities in renown. So that's why Wood had a desire to rival Portland. Now, they soon gained the backing of Times publisher Aidan J. Blethyn, remarkably for the time without getting the opposition of rival Seattle Post-Intelligencer. Among other early proponents of the exposition was John Edward Chilberg, one of a line of prominent Seattle merchants in the Chilberg family, who was president of the Alaska Club and was then given the title of president of the exposition. Now, those are the main proprietors, the main founding fathers, one must say, of the fair. But another important figure who actually had gotten the fairgrounds to be hosted on University of Washington campus was Edmund S. Meany. Edmund S. Meany proposed that the exposition be held on the then largely forested campus of the University of Washington, which in 1905 had exactly 3 buildings and little deliberate landscaping. Now, as you said before, we're both students. Can you imagine the University of Washington with only 3 buildings?
No.
It's small, tiny, forested. Now, in fact, on this side of Lake Union, there was no development. It was far from downtown. So it's a very peculiar spot to pick for a World's Fair. Now, at the time, this was considered rather far from the center of town, as I said before. But Meany eventually sold the others involved on the idea that the forested campus itself could be an attraction for out-of-town visitors, and that the trolley ride from downtown would not be an obstacle to attendance. Of course, he was also highly aware of what the landscaping and structures could do for the campus. Now, Edmund S. Meany, also to bring this into context, was a history professor at the University of Washington. So he wanted to bring the splendor of the World's Fair to his university, and soon we'll find out how successful he was. Now, the legislative nexus of this podcast, one of the reasons we're covering it, is because the state legislature at the time had a role to play in the fair. Now, the state legislature endorsed the fair with the proviso that it would produce at least 4 permanent buildings and that any state monetary contribution would be focused mainly on those buildings. King County stepped up with $300,000 at the time for a forestry exhibit, the largest log cabin ever built, and $78,000 for other exhibits. Because the original Klondike gold strikes have been in Canada, the concept soon evolved to an Alaska-Yukon-Exposition. Later, at the behest of the Seattle Chamber of Commerce, the Pacific theme was also added to emphasize the Asian trade. The exposition became known as AYP for short, as stated before. Although the fair almost certainly could have been ready for 1907, it was postponed till 1909. The exposition had been held in 1909 without financial failure, where now they believe if it was held in 1907, it would have been a bust. So under the design and construction of the fair, the Olmsted brothers of Brookline, Massachusetts were selected to plan the exposition. Now, this firm was already known for building. Do you know anything that somebody from Massachusetts could build?
No.
Neither do I. It's Massachusetts. What's there? All right. But New York, this firm, these brothers, they were known for building Central Park in New York. And they were hired on to come build for the fairgrounds at the University of Washington for the 1909 World's Fair. Now, John C. Olmsted visited Seattle in October 1906 and saw the dominant form of Mount Rainier toward the southeast. He selected the mountain as the focus of the primary access of the exposition. Can you think of anywhere on campus where we could see Mount Rainier?
I can think of at least one.
At least one.
Now, that would be, what's it called? Rainier Vista.
Rainier Vista.
Rainier Vista.
Vista, tomato. The important thing to know is that Rainier Vista came from this World's Fair, and that Rainier Vista, which is now a permanent part of the University of Washington's campus, was produced by John C. Olmsted during this World's Fair. Now, the principal landscape architect for the fair was the Olmsted firm's James Frederick Dawson. His design centered on a long pool with a series of short waterfalls along Rainier Vista. John Galen, Howard's firm, Howard and Galloway, based in San Francisco, was chosen as supervising architect for the exposition buildings. They designed several buildings and supervised construction of those designed by other architects. The fairground were entirely ready for the June 1st, 1909 opening. Now, a few of the exhibits that they had here, some were foreign countries, some were of U.S. territories. We're going to get into that. The only foreign countries to erect entire buildings at the fair were Japan and Canada, but their presence was enough to validate the Pacific theme along the U.S. territory of Hawaii and the Philippines, recently ceded to the U.S. by Spain. Other foreign countries were represented on a smaller scale. The very popular King County exhibit included a scale model of the coal mine at nearby Newcastle, Washington, and dioramas of several Seattle scenes, the originals of which were only a trolley ride away. The Women's Building emphasized the role of women in pioneering their American West and in current charity work. The Pay Streak, which was another exhibit, was Seattle's answer to Chicago's Midway and featured games of chance and amusements. There was also a reenactment of the American Civil War, naval Battle of Hampton Roads.
You know, Max, what's interesting to me about the AYP,
right,
and these exhibits, is, you know, we've discussed already how Seattle is being marketed by all these business interests.
Right.
One of them even being a professor of history at UW.
Right.
You know, over 100 years ago now. You know, marketed as a gateway to the Pacific, to Alaska, marketed as, you know, a more competitive market than Tacoma and Portland, and, you know, sort of the final conquering of the frontier as the United States had expanded to the coast.
Right.
Is that at this point in time, the United States had made acquisitions abroad, Hawaii, the Philippines, and so right here in Seattle, you know, you have these exhibits and you have these, you know, new buildings and, you know, fountains and of course this was summertime. One of those fountains, which stands today, being Drumheller Fountain. And of course there's the you know, the very powerful image of Mount Rainier,
right,
which exists today, that you can go see even today and get a sense of what this expo would have been like. But it's just interesting how Seattle became sort of a nexus. Maybe the wrong word, but it's sort of a keystone in this great Pacific chain, as the keystone of the Pacific chain, beating out Portland and Tacoma, but connecting the United States with its, you know, acquisitions abroad in the Pacific to the east, with Alaska, and sort of this and sort of this, you know, this event that is really just so emblematic of this first decade of it. And what speaks to that the most, to me, is the fact there's a women's building. Yeah. There's a women's building that is specifically dedicated to the works of charity that women do. Now that's interesting, only because at this point in time, in the early 1900s, as in the first decade, is during this wave of globalization, is you also have the the development of humanitarianism, right? The notion of humanitarianism for the first time. And so it's interesting to me that this women's building that is there to commemorate and to celebrate the role of women is catered to the idea of charity, right? You know, with the knowledge, as you know, that this was sort of when humanitarianism came into the common, or you could say in the sort of urban educated consciousness, right? Of not just the East Coast and the political centers of the United States and all of its affairs in Europe and elsewhere, but on the West Coast. That this was the sort of filling out of a continental United States, and that these were some of the themes of the period that were only specific to this time.
Yeah. It is important to note the history of strong women in Seattle. For example, we learned something in our Seattle Fire podcast done by our very own Paris, that one of the largest proprietors to building back Seattle, or bringing Seattle back after the fire, was a businesswoman.
And in fact, the first woman mayor of a major American city was Bertha Knight Landis, elected in 1926, and she served as mayor of Seattle.
Wow.
First woman mayor.
Fascinating. Well, it's also important to note that everything wasn't progressive here. Everything wasn't hunky-dory, fine and dandy, gin and brandy. There were moments of white exceptionalism in this fair. Now, we'll get into the meat of that
Of
later.
American exceptionalism, white supremacy, even despite a women's building, many cases, sort of violence and enclosure.
And we'll get into that towards the end. But now, let's talk a little bit about the opening ceremony. The gates were opened at 8:30 a.m. on June 1st, and the crowd rushed in immediately, or so it's told. At 9:30 a.m., attendees watched performances by military bands from the Army and the Navy. Many sat in the fair's amphitheater, awaiting a signal scheduled to be given in Washington, D.C. at 3 p.m. East Coast time, noon in Seattle. In the East Room of the White House, President Taft sent the signal. He opened the exposition by touching a gold telegraph key, studded with gold nuggets taken from the first mine opened in the Klondike region. Now, isn't that fascinating? The telegraph spark that Taft sent was received by telegraphers at the fairgrounds. As soon as it arrived, a gong was struck 5 times. Gong, 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 gong. Is that 5? Okay, sweet.
Gong, 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 gong. That was 4.
A large American flag was unfurled, and there were 21 gun salutes. I'm not going to do all 21. While other demonstrations of pageantry announced the official opening of the fair. Now, on opening day, it was declared a city holiday, and 80,000 people attended. Attendance was even higher, 117,000 on Seattle Day. Other big draws were days dedicated to various ethnic groups, fraternal organizations in U.S. states. Now, we'll get into the ethnic groups in a little bit, but that draws back onto what we said earlier about white exceptionalism. By the time the fair closed on October 16th, more than 3,700,000 people attended. Wow, that's a lot of people. For example, Seattle's population today is around 700 some odd thousand. Now, this is nearly 3 to 4 times larger than the entire population of Seattle today, 100 years later, had visited the city.
Over the course of months.
Months.
Which is very interesting.
That's very interesting, insane, and that's why they called it a World's Fair. The fair had its own publicity department, and it used newspapers and magazines to promote the upcoming exhibition well in advance. In early 1908, Seattle newspapers reported that the publicity department was already showing positive results, and the fair was earning many favorable mentions in publications all over the United States. The publicists stressed that this exhibition would be far better organized than the 1907 Jamestown Exposition and would feature entertainment. But what many newspapers found interesting was the assertion that this next World's Fair would not require any financial assistance or subsidies from the U.S. government. The only request made by the fair's directors was the United States erect buildings and exhibits like any other country. Throughout 1908, as each new exhibit was built and the fair gradually began to take shape, publicity about the fair's progress was sent out and frequently printed nearly verbatim from the press release. For example, the Tampa Tribune in Tampa, Florida printed a story about how the fair would have motorboat races. The article noted that the pavilion for the event was being built on one of the prettiest spots on the exposition shoreline. The article praised Puget Sound for being an area perfect for motorboating enthusiasts and concluded by saying, "The climate is such that motorboating can be enjoyed all year round."
Is that true, Max?
I don't believe that's true. I believe when it's cold and it's rainy and it's in the late fall, early winter, that's miserable. I would hate to motorboat.
I completely.
Now, it's interesting that, they took the press releases verbatim and printed them out in all areas of the world. Lazy press, if you ask me.
I mean, that's hilarious, right? The Tampa Tribune in Tampa, Florida, literally across the country.
Other end.
The other end.
Northwest, southeast.
To the southeast. Mm-hmm. Is saying that, the Alaska-Pacific-Yukon-Expo. I'm sorry, the Alaska-Yukon-Pacific-Expo.
AYP.
Great motorboating all year round.
Yeah.
That's kind of insane.
That is a little insane that it got this much coverage and that covered here. And it makes you think about nowadays, how many times do people just take press releases verbatim, print them out without doing any research? Stay careful what you listen to and what you read, kids, but not the history podcasts. Our stuff is accurate. And by early 1909, the focus turned to who was going to attend, as many local newspapers in distant locations wrote articles about residents of their state who planned to make the trip out to Seattle. Also helpful was the fact that several major newspaper conventions were scheduled for the West Coast, and the editors were said to be very interested in visiting the fair. The fair's organizers were also able to benefit from advertisements placed in newspapers by the railroads, which encouraged people to travel by rail to Seattle. One such ad for the Great Northern Railway promoted the train as the best way to enjoy a scenic trip. And they said an attractive route over the Rockies and through the Cascades before finally arriving at what was sure to be the world's most beautiful fair. Now that we learned a little bit about the attendance of the fair, the building of this fair, and the organization around this fair, let's learn about the legacies of this fair. The primary physical legacy of the Alaska-Yukon-Pacific-Exposition is the planning framework from the fair, which continues to shape the University of Washington campus. As stated, the Rainier Vista and Geyser Basin, presently known as Drumheller Fountain, as you mentioned, were central features of the exposition and now serve as the focal point of the science quadrangle within the university's comprehensive. Although most of the exposition's buildings were designed as temporary structures intended to last only for the duration of the fair, some were more permanent. The Fine Arts Palace was designed by Howard and Galloway as a chemistry building. It was used during the AYP for the exhibit of art. After the exposition was over, chemistry lab tables and other furnishings were moved in, and it became the university's primary facility for teaching chemistry. Fun fact. The building was named Bagley Hall after Daniel Bagley, and it retained that name until 1937, when a new chemistry building named Bagley Hall opened. The older building then became the home of architecture and physiology. The building survives today, albeit with extensive renovation and restoration, and it is now known as Architecture Hall.
Creative.
Is it Creative Architecture Hall now?
No, the name of Architecture Hall. Very creative.
Oh, the name is creative.
Yeah.
Okay. I thought there was a name change that I didn't know of. Okay, yes. It is very creative. Put the architects in Architecture Hall. Well, the AYP's women's building that we were talking about also survives. During the fair, it housed exhibits related to women. Today, the building is named Cunningham Hall, after Imogen Cunningham, one of the only few buildings on the University of Washington's campus named for women. During the exposition itself, the building was clad in stucco. Today, it is faced in wood siding. The building now houses various educational and other programs related to women. Other buildings from the AYP survived for a time, but were subsequently demolished as the university grew. The forestry building was demolished mid-century after the natural logs of the structure proved difficult to maintain, and few alternative uses for the structure were found. It stood on the site of the current Husky Union Built Hub. The original Meany Hall, the AYP Auditorium Hall, was damaged by an earthquake in 1965 and subsequently demolished. Another example is the Hoo Hoo Houses, or the Hoo Hoo House, designed by architect Ellsworth Story, a clubhouse with reception spaces constructed for the Hoo Hoo, a lumberman fraternity. After the fair, this building served as the faculty club until it was replaced in 1958 to 1960 by the current faculty club. Another legacy of the fair was the enhanced status exposition president, J.E. Chilberg. Although a respected banker, Chilberg had never really been one of the city's elites. He was drafted into his position with the fair simply as a man who was known to be good at getting things done, without consideration by the city's elites that they had just made an outsider into something tantamount to royalty for the duration of a socials. Suddenly, any party at their First Hill home became a major event in the social calendar. He and his wife found themselves dining with a close relative of the Emperor of Japan and hosting a French ambassador. The statue of William H. Seward, originally erected for the fair, now stands in Volunteer Park. William Boeing, founder of Boeing, stated it was during the Alaska-Yukon-Pacific-Exposition when he saw a manned flying machine for the first time and fascinated with aircraft.
And, Boeing, world's leading plane,
right,
based in Washington. The childhood aspirations, curiosity of a young William Boeing were found and were sort of the seed of flight was sowed in William Boeing's brain.
Right.
at the AYP.
And that's a huge, huge, huge part is Willie.
If you've never been on a Boeing airplane, you've probably seen.
Exactly. They're everywhere. All right. Now we're going to get into the darker side of the fair to end it off.
For sure.
Now, there were some controversies that surrounded this fair. One were labor objections. Because the exposition buildings were built with non-union labor, various unions protested against the exposition in actions ranging from pamphleteering to boycotts. The Central Labor Council organized a protest march outside the grounds on Labor Day. The Seattle Socialist editorialized that the exposition was a great, fantastic monument to the brutal avarice of the capital class. And along with the labor objections, there were human exhibits.
That's right.
Human exhibits that included...
And that is to say exhibits of
live humans.
Human beings in captivity.
Yes, exhibits of live humans. Now, there's one, a month-old orphan boy named Ernest was raffled away as a prize. Although a winning ticket was drawn, nobody claimed the prize. The ultimate destiny of the child was still being invested as late as 2009. Can you imagine that? A month-old being raffled away as a prize.
And I mean, what's more... I mean, so that's sort of an insane idea. But, over 100, you can see that. I think what speaks more to the sort of the inhumaneness, not so fun fact, is that the winning ticket was drawn and nobody claimed the prize.
And that is really dark. And there were other moments that were akin to this, such as human exhibits included displays presenting the Igorot people from the Philippines as dog-eating primitive people, the Alaskan Siberian Eskimos,
quote unquote, and a Chinese village depicting opium dens and recounting the recent Boxer Rebellion. Now, going into the first one, the Igorot exhibit spawned a letter of protest to the Seattle Post-Intelligencer signed by over 100 Filipino merchant marines, although some local resident Filipinos responded to the letter by defending the exhibit. And, I think what's interesting is, on the one hand, you have this humanitarianist current in the American culture and sort of also the United States being sort of at this time a world leader in technology and culture and really as a rising power on the world stage. The United States is rising. What's interesting is that there's that humanitarianist, or rather humanitarian current in the air, sort of coming to the fore, entering the consciousness of maybe the average American, or at least those who read newspapers or were interested in foreign affairs, people who are educated and whatnot. But on the other hand, you also have, and on that first point, I mean, the women's building, you had, a tribute to and a commemoration of the hard and often, untold work of women. But on the other hand, you also have what is basically, a monument or just is there a raffle of an orphan child.
Right.
And just how disturbing, or rather, how disturbing it is that kid was offered as a raffle prize and that nobody claimed it, that someone won it, but nobody claimed the orphan boy.
That is really sad. And
it's morbid.
It
is the word I'm looking for. It's really morbid. And what's more is that you have, on the modern day UW Seattle campus, a World's Fair where, Filipino people were put in cages,
right, and
they were brought over from this territory that the United States had just acquired, and they were displayed as like a zoo, like an exhibited at a zoo of like, look at look at what modern American men have brought over,
right,
from faraway places, savages, barbarians.
Exactly. And I think a good thing to note with that, right, is that they're displaying Filipino people, or specifically the Igorot, as a tribe or people that is underdeveloped. And now it's important to know that in 1909, at this point, the United States was trying to figure out itself on the world stage. Now, there was a huge debate on whether it should hold the Philippines, on whether the United States should be an imperialist power as it was positioning itself to. And arguments on both sides of the aisle included a white supremacist complex. You had people who were anti-imperialist, who viewed as Anglo-Americans as the people who should be preserved, and we should not go out there and muddy ourselves in non-Anglo-American affairs.
Yeah, that these people were uncivilized and that they couldn't be civilized.
Exactly.
And so that it really wasn't the job of the United States as a major international power
And
to
then
even conquer. It wasn't even worth the trouble to conquer.
And people who were pro-imperialists also viewed it under a white lens.
Yeah.
Saw it as something as a civilizing mission.
The humanitarian.
The humanitarian aspect, exactly. Yeah. And that's one interesting thing to note. But sadly, I believe that is it for the podcast. Tommy.
It is. I can't believe we're done.
I've enjoyed having you here with me. Thanks for talking about the AYP, the Alaska-Yukon-Pacific-Exposition with me.
My pleasure. Thank you, Max, for telling us this great story. I know that myself and the listeners at home are engaging with these histories and remembering what brought us here and makes us wonder what's in store for our futures.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to think about the legislature creating a proviso to build permanent structures at the AYP.
Right.
Creating what is now the modern day UW Seattle campus where we both go.
Yes.
And we've met in this internship through our attendance at public schools in Washington State.
Yes.
Or that public school in specific.
Right.
And that, about a century ago, things were not, as you said, Max, what was it?
Hunky-dory.
Hunky-dory.
Fine and dandy.
Fine and dandy.
Gin and brandy.
Gin and brandy.
There you go.
But it's been a pleasure, Max, and thank you sincerely for putting up with my stuff.
Of course, and thanks for being here. And I would like to thank every one of you at home, in your car, at your job, wherever you're listening to this. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you guys each have a wonderful day.